The film begins with Nigel and Fiona Dobson, a couple celebrating their 7th wedding anniversary by traveling to Istanbul. The couple appears to be on a cruise ship. They discover a woman on the ship's bathroom floor one day. Because the girl is crying and weeping on the bathroom floor, the couple decides to take matters into their own hands and take her with them. The couple appears to be taking good care of the elderly lady. Fiona falls asleep that evening, exhausted from caring for the girl. Nigel goes to the ship's bar because he's been left alone. Nigel sees the woman from earlier dancing alone in the bar, oblivious to the rest of the world. Despite being happily married, Nigel is obsessed with her holy body. The girl makes a move and approaches Nigel. Nigel gets her a drink and attempts to converse with her. He inquires about her previous breakdown in the bathroom. She asks Nigel to entertain her instead of responding to his question, and Nigel nervously obliges. Nigel recognizes her French accent and mistakenly refers to her as a frog with those legs. She leaves on the deck after being unimpressed by Nigel's white humor. A man in a wheelchair approaches Nigel and warns him that the woman is a walking man-trap. To Nigel's surprise, the man reveals himself to be the husband of the woman Nigel was flirting with. The elderly man takes off his blanket, revealing his swollen legs. He creeps Nigel out even more by telling him that he brought the misery of being a handicapped person on himself. However, Nigel does not appear curious, nor does he demand to know why. Through the door, the physically challenged man requests Nigel's assistance. Nigel assists him in getting to his room. The man finally introduces himself as Oscar Benton as they travel. Oscar requests that Nigel allow him to tell his side of the story. Nigel is intrigued to learn that Oscar comes from a wealthy American family and has had his dreams of becoming a writer dashed. Oscar begins the story in Paris because that is where he first met the woman, Michelle, who also goes by the name Mimi. In the very first scene, Oscar meets Mimi at the bus stop, where she does not have enough money to pay the bus fare. Oscar, ever the gentleman, pays for her bus ticket. The two exchange a long, intense stare before parting ways. Oscar has arrived in Paris to follow in the literary footsteps of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and his other literary heroes. He writes numerous articles but is unable to publicize them. Oscar has trouble sleeping, eating, or working on his writings when Mimi's thoughts are stuck in his head. Oscar, plagued by writer's block, decides to go on a blind date. He finds Mimi waiting for someone else at the restaurant. Unable to keep his cool, he approaches Mimi and asks her out on a date. She accepts Oscar's proposal, believing she owes him a favor after the bus fare incident. They go to a fancy restaurant the next day after her dance class. They raise a glass to the bus route where they first meet. Mimi, in Oscar's opinion, was a blend of bodily maturity and childish naivete that transcended their age difference. She requests to read what he has written, and he requests to see her dance. Oscar gets butterflies in his stomach when Mimi reveals that she still has his purchased bus ticket with her. They later go to his house and begin a business meeting. Oscar considers himself extremely fortunate to have met such a lovely young lady as Mimi. He confesses his love to Mimi one night as they begin to spend more time together. They both kiss and start dating. Mimi performs a sensual dance for him on their first night as a couple. Both of them sleep together. Mimi teases Oscar in the morning by playing with her food and spilling milk all over her body. Oscar assists her in cleaning up. Things get heated between them while cleaning up Mimi, and they both get intimate and practice oral on each other. Oscar and Nigel have spent a lot of time together on the cruise in the present. He also makes fun of his sensual and erotic life with Mimi, making Nigel extremely uncomfortable. He speaks about Mimi's lady cave in a variety of literary jargons. Oscar thanks him for listening for as long as he could as he gets up to leave. Nigel returns to his cabin, where Fiona has already fallen asleep. Oscar joins them for lunch the next day, while Mimi goes to dine with the ship's captain. Oscar compliments Fiona on her beauty, which causes Nigel and her to become nervous. He talks about relationships after seeing the two together for a long time. Even good relationships, he believes, have farces and tragedies. Mimi returns and massages Nigel's feet after Nigel attempts to change the awkward topic to the weather. As they leave, Nigel becomes visibly uneasy. Oscar invites Nigel to join him once more. Later, Oscar continues his story about his and Mimi's skiing vacation. Oscar's stories become more graphic and disturbing with each encounter. Oscar suspects Nigel has a bad physical relationship with Fiona because he expresses his discomfort. Nigel becomes enraged, but Oscar consoles him and continues his story. The scene shifts back in time, and Oscar and Mimi begin to experiment. Oscar wants to be humiliated by a beautiful woman, and things become tense. Mimi cuts his clothes, and they do strange things. Oscar once asks Mimi if his writing is of good quality. She claims her English is insufficient to judge, and instead attempts to be intimate with Oscar. Oscar is irritated by his extremely intimate life. To relieve their tension, they go out with their friends to a bar for a change of scenery. When he becomes too flirtatious with another woman, Mimi responds by dancing with another man. They kiss in their ardor. Oscar is hurt as a result of witnessing it. He storms out of the bar and returns to his house. Mimi returns home after a few hours and inquires as to why he left without saying anything. Oscar becomes enraged, but she begs him to forgive her. They continue to have wild fantasies, but things aren't as hot as they used to be. Mimi approaches us while Oscar is narrating. Oscar, being open with Nigel, mentions that they both have a common interest in Mimi. Nigel rushes back to his cabin, where Fiona notices he has been gone for quite some time. She becomes envious of Mimi, but Nigel reassures her that everything is fine. They later run into Isaiah Singh and his daughter Amrita Singh. Isaiah inquires if they have any children. It appears that Nigel does not want to have children, whereas his wife is desperate to start a family. Nigel returns to his cabin to get some warm clothes, but is stopped on the way by Mimi. Oscar, she claims, is a sick man, and Nigel should not believe everything he says. She extends an invitation to him to her cabin. Later that evening, Nigel informs Fiona that he will see Oscar again. Nigel does not go to Oscar this time. Instead, he goes to Mimi. When he walks into her cabin, her room is dark and she is lying on the bed. He takes her hand in his and kisses it, but it's Oscar. Mimi enters the room from behind, laughing, leaving Nigel embarrassed and humiliated. Oscar then informs Nigel that Mimi likes him and would like Oscar to tell him the entire story. Nigel is frustrated, but Oscar tells him that if he listens to his story, he can have Mimi. Oscar admits that he and Mimi should have stopped when their passion faded, but he couldn't bear the thought of giving up that booty. The scene shifts back in time. Oscar is seen this time visiting a female editor for his book. He's concerned that Mimi's lovely outfit will make the editor envious. At the meeting, they have a disagreement. Mimi spills the editor's drink on her lap, ruining her dress. Oscar notices it and starts an argument in their room. She threatens to leave Oscar after seeing him explode in rage. Because he's unconcerned about it, she gathers her belongings, bids him farewell, and attempts to leave. But Oscar is too preoccupied with his writing. Mimi can't bear leaving him and begs his forgiveness once more. He chastises her one day for drinking milk straight from the bottle. She responds by disparaging his books. He insults her dancing career without realizing he's going too far. She reacts to Oscar's insult by hurling a milk bottle at him. They fight, and he slaps her with a triple combo. Mimi falls unconscious, and Oscar is terrified. He calls the hospital, trembling, but thankfully she wakes up. He begs forgiveness just as she asks him to hold her. Mimi appears to be happy for some reason, despite the fact that she has large marks on her face. She brags about how sweet they are as a couple, but Oscar tells her the hard truth. Oscar thinks they are terrible with each other. He suggests that they stop, but Mimi wants to marry him and have his children instead. He claims to despise her existence, which is the final straw. This upsets her, and she walks away crying. Mimi later calls him to patch things up, but he declines. He has a lonely night at the bar, and when he returns home, she is waiting for him. She begs him to return her, but he's cold and uncaring. She grabs his legs again and begs, saying she'll do whatever he wants. With no other option, Oscar becomes determined to make her life a living hell so that she will leave on her own. During their lovemaking, he calls her by a different woman's name, breaking her heart. The next day, she cuts her hair, but he doesn't notice because he's on the phone with another woman. She cooks a turkey for him, but he mocks her efforts. He walks away without tasting anything. Mimi gradually loses confidence and self-esteem. She doesn't care about her appearance or figure while he flirts with other women. He yells at her for disturbing him and insults her looks again when she tries to clean the place. Mimi sits by Oscar's side one day and breaks the big news. When she tells Oscar he's going to be a father, he becomes upset and asks her to have the fetus aborted. Oscar almost tears up seeing her in such poor condition and ends up promising her a vacation once she's recovered. Oscar experiences severe pain on the plane and is removed. Mimi flies alone after realizing Oscar abandoned her. Back in the present, Nigel, who has been listening to the entire story, shames Oscar for his obstinacy and misogynistic demeanor. Meanwhile, Mimi is waiting for him outside and inquires as to whether he is still angry with her. She wanted him to hear the story and pass judgment on her. He approaches her and kisses her. When he asks when they can be alone, she tells him to let the story finish first. Nigel goes to his wife, who is drunk, and accuses him of missing dinner and abandoning her. On the way back, they argue about his crushes on Oscar and Mimi. Fiona becomes seasick later that night. Nigel hands her some pills and walks over to Oscar. Oscar's story continues. Mimi became a public property after being dumped on the plane. He began hooking up with every girl he saw. The scene shifts back in time as Oscar narrates the story. He is hit by a bus one day while on a similar public service. He survives, but with a concussion and a broken leg. Mimi is the only one of his new female friends who comes to check on him. She's gone through a major transformation. She reveals that she works as a hotel dancer. Oscar speaks sarcastically and tells her to leave his life. She stands up and extends her hand as a final goodbye. When he takes it, she pulls him out of bed, and he becomes terrified after losing the life in his legs. She then takes care of him, and he has no control over it. He realizes she might still be in love with him. Oscar receives a call from his editor about an important matter one day. She answers his phone on his behalf and lies about his illness and inability to speak. Oscar blows his chance with his book due to Mimi's jealousy. Mimi is unconcerned and dresses attractively. Oscar begins to lash out, being extremely cruel to her, but she tells him to stop. Oscar is unable to do anything but sit in his solitary confinement. When Mimi returns the next morning, he begins to cry. As he sobs about his permanent disability, she pulls out a gun as a birthday present and hands it to him. She mockingly sings happy birthday to him and brings him a cake the size of his self-esteem. The coin had been flipped since that day. It was Mimi's turn to humiliate Oscar, who was disabled and unfulfilled. She reveals at a picnic that she will never be able to have children because the abortion operation left her with an infection. Hearing this, Oscar expresses his disdain for himself. Mimi, to his surprise, reminds him that she despises him even more. Oscar is taken aback that Mimi no longer loves him. One day, she purposefully pretends to be on the phone longer and abandons Oscar in the cold bathtub, forcing him to crawl out. Another time, she invites a hot stud to dinner and flirts with him. She even gets him to sensually dance with her and entertain her, but he is incapable of appreciating this form of art. They go to the next room and get freaky while Oscar looks at them helplessly. Oscar and Mimi eventually marry despite their dislike for each other, and that is the end of his story. Things are no longer bad, but Oscar is still terrified. Nigel claims to understand him better and leaves to check on his ailing wife. However, she is still battling her illness. The following day is New Year's Eve, and the ship has thrown a celebration. Nigel goes out on his own and dances with Mimi. Oscar gives him his approval. After the New Year's Eve countdown, they meet at the bar and talk about Mimi. Mimi and Oscar have a vulnerable but brief moment together. She then invites Nigel to join her in the dance. He leans in to kiss Mimi during the dance, but she rejects him and says the story is still incomplete. Fiona appears, fully recovered from her seasickness. Nigel tries to speak to her nervously, but since she caught him in the act, she does not appreciate her husband having feelings for another woman. Instead, she follows Mimi into a sensual dance. Nigel can only stand there and watch as these two lovebirds mate. Oscar tells him to stop moping around. In the most shocking plot twist, Mimi and Fiona walk away, implying that they were in love. Nigel runs out onto the deck and screams into the wind. He goes to Fiona's room after a while, but Oscar is already there. Oscar remarks that the two girls are sleeping and that this is a wonderful allegory for grace and beauty. He then compliments Fiona's physique. This enrages Nigel. Nigel chokes Oscar for using a foul mouth when talking about his wife. Oscar, on the other hand, has a gun that Mimi gave him for his birthday. Oscar declares Nigel unworthy of hearing the rest of the story because he choked him to death. Oscar shoots Mimi while Nigel cowers in terror. Fiona is startled and rushes to a nearby corner. Oscar sobs, claiming that he and Mimi were simply too greedy, and then shoots himself later. The guards remove the bodies. Nigel and Fiona are standing outside. Amrit arrives bearing a message from her father wishing her a happy new year. Fiona sobs into Nigel's arms, and they hug and hold each other tight.